Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a world far older than the ticking wristwatches or digital displays we glance at every day. A world where time itself is something you read not from a screen, but from the sky. Tonight, we're heading to ancient Babylon, the beating heart of Mesopotamia, where priests climbed stone towers to watch the heavens, and kings measured their power not just by conquests, but by the steady march of celestial cycles. You're about to step barefoot into dusty courtyards, pass beneath gates carved with lions, and lie on rooftops where scribes once charted the slow waltz of the stars. And you probably won't survive this if you show up without sandals, water, or a basic tolerance for 45-degree desert heat. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. Because, well, after tonight, you might start thinking about time a little differently. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand on the baked clay streets of Babylon, sometime around 1800 BCE. The city hums softly around you, a mosaic of mud brick walls and bustling courtyards. It smells of baked bread and river silt. Somewhere nearby, a goat complains. Above you stretches a vast, cloudless sky, a canvas of relentless blue by day, a glittering tapestry by night. And in this world, that sky is everything. It tells the farmers when to plant, the priests when to sacrifice, and the kings when to declare their reign blessed by the gods. Time here isn't just something that passes, it's something that lives in the heavens. The Babylonians didn't invent timekeeping, but they perfected it in ways that still shape how you live today. Every minute, every second on your watch, every calendar notification pinging your phone has a faint echo of these people who stared up from the banks of the Euphrates and tried to make sense of the cosmos. And they did it not with telescopes or atomic clocks, but with keen eyes, baked clay, and a whole lot of patient watching. You wander deeper into the city and find yourself drawn toward its heart, the towering ziggurat known as Etemenanki, the house that is the foundation of heaven and earth. It's said this stepped temple pierces the boundary between mortal and divine. Climb its ancient stairs, and you'd find more than just offerings and incense. You'd find some of the earliest astronomers at work. They're priests, yes, but they're also data gatherers, sky recorders, and timekeepers, tracking the universe with a precision that would impress even NASA, albeit with significantly more incense and slightly fewer budget meetings. Here's a mainstream historical fact for you. By around the 2nd millennium BCE, the Babylonians were already keeping detailed astronomical diaries, long clay tablets filled with nightly records of celestial positions, lunar phases, eclipses, and planetary motions. These weren't idle curiosities. The patterns they found were the heartbeat of their calendar, their rituals, and even their politics. But before they got to that sophisticated level, they had to master something more basic, knowing what time it was on a daily basis. You and I can glance at a clock and know instantly, but in Babylon, the sky was the only clock that mattered. And every rising shadow, every shifting star was a tick on that cosmic timepiece. It's strange to imagine living in a world without hours or minutes, where your day is measured instead by the length of your own shadow or the angle of the sun's glare on the river. Yet that's how most Babylonians lived. Time wasn't an abstract number, but a lived, physical experience. You'd wake when the sun painted the mud brick walls with gold, eat when its heat grew unbearable, and sleep when Orion tipped over the horizon. Historians still argue whether Babylonian society had a rigid daily schedule the way we do today, or if time remained a more fluid concept until much later. Some evidence suggests temple rituals and marketplace hours were quite structured, while other records hint that ordinary people cared far less about exact times and more about right moments. Either way, their sky-driven approach meant that cosmic rhythms dictated earthly ones. One quirky detail here, Babylonian priests would sometimes describe certain times of night by referencing which stars rose just above the horizon. So instead of saying, "Meet me at 10 p.m., someone might say, "Meet me when the bull's horn first lifts its eye," which, to be fair, is still less confusing than trying to understand modern train timetables. The deeper you walk into this ancient world, the more you realize just how intertwined timekeeping was with meaning. Each sunrise wasn't just the start of a new day, it was a divine act. Each full moon wasn't just a calendar marker, it was a message from Sin, the moon god, whose silver light governed the passage of months. Time was sacred, and measuring it wasn't just practical, it was holy. That's why the task fell not to merchants or farmers, but to the temple elite. Up on the ziggurat, high above the noise and dust of the city, they watched. Night after night, year after year. They noticed that the stars didn't wander randomly. They rose and set in patterns, slow and majestic, repeating like verses of a cosmic hymn. They measured those patterns against the river floods, the harvest cycles, and the rhythms of human life. And from that patient observation, they built the foundations of astronomy and timekeeping that still endure. It wasn't a quick process. Generations of skywatchers added their data to the clay archive, chiseling away at ignorance one star chart at a time. And sometimes they got it wrong, wildly wrong. Early Babylonian texts, for example, confidently assert that certain planets were living gods traveling across the heavens. Mars wasn't a red dot of iron-rich rock, it was Nergal, a divine warrior whose temper could shake empires. Jupiter? Marduk, king of the gods, ruler of fate. Today, we'd call that myth. Back then, it was science and theology rolled into one. Yet, even amid the myths, their data collection was astonishingly accurate. They noticed, for instance, that certain stars return to the same point in the sky every 365 days. They tracked the moon's phases with enough precision to predict eclipses centuries before the Greeks formalized the concept. They even realized that some planets, the wandering stars, followed strange backward loops in the night sky, a phenomenon we now call retrograde motion. They didn't know why. Heliocentrism was still a couple of thousand years away, but they knew it happened, and they logged it faithfully. One can almost picture the scene. Lying on a cool rooftop at night, the Euphrates whispering in the distance, the heat of the day finally bleeding away into a velvet dark sky. Around you, the city is quiet. In the distance, a temple drum beats slow and steady, marking the start of a ritual tied to the new moon. And above you, the constellations creep westward in their eternal dance. In that silence, time feels different. Not a thing you measure, but a thing you inhabit. And maybe that's the real lesson the Babylonians offer us here at the very beginning of our journey. That time was never meant to be sliced into neat little squares on a calendar or tracked by a buzzing phone notification. It was meant to be watched, felt, and lived, a river flowing overhead as much as underfoot. In the next stretch of our story, you'll see how those first, humble skywatches turned into real technology, how shadows on the ground and shifting sand gave birth to the world's earliest clocks. But for now, lying here under this ancient Mesopotamian sky, you feel the heartbeat of time itself. Slow, rhythmic, eternal. And it all starts here, where humans first dared to read the universe as a calendar. You wake early, Or rather, you rise when the city does, because nobody in Babylon has an alarm clock to insist otherwise. The sun itself is the signal, slipping over the flat Mesopotamian horizon like a molten coin, scattering golden light across the Euphrates. The first cries of the marketplace mingle with the shuffle of sandals and the clatter of water jars. And while you stretch the sleep from your limbs, one thing becomes immediately clear. Every movement here, every trade, prayer, and meal depends on knowing where that blazing disk is in the sky. Back in the 21st century, you might think of time as an independent thing, a number on your phone, disconnected from the weather or the angle of light. But in Babylon, time is entirely bound to the physical world, and nothing is more fundamental than the daily journey of the sun. It starts simply enough. Before anyone is building calendars or predicting eclipses, people here are watching shadows. Stand a stick upright in the dirt, and the shadow it casts will shrink and stretch in predictable ways throughout the day. At dawn, it's long and points west. At noon, or as close as the Babylonians will call noon, it's shortest, almost directly beneath the stick. By sunset, it's long again, this time stretching east. That humble shifting shadow is the first clock you'll ever use. As early as the Old Babylonian period, around 1900 to 1600 BCE, Mesopotamians were experimenting with shadow tracking, the conceptual ancestors of sundials. They didn't yet have the elegant stone dials you might imagine from Greek or Roman times, but they understood the principle. The sun's path was regular, and with careful observation, you could divide the day into meaningful segments. The Babylonians weren't the only ones to figure this out. Egyptians and Chinese astronomers were tinkering with similar ideas, but in Mesopotamia, the practice quickly became part of everyday life. Builders aligned temples with the sun's rising points. Farmers used shadow lengths to decide when to water crops. And temple priests, perched high on their ziggurats, recorded the sun's positions with almost obsessive regularity. There's something beautifully human about this. Imagine yourself standing in a dusty courtyard with a stick jammed into the ground, squinting at the thin shadow it throws. At first, it seems random, but come back every day and you'll see the pattern. The sun's arc rises a little higher in summer, a little lower in winter. The shadow's shortest point, your noon, creeps slightly across the ground as the seasons turn. With enough patience, you can even mark out solstices and equinoxes. It's the universe's clock, etched right into the dirt. Of course, the Babylonians didn't stop with shadows. They were nothing if not ingenious when it came to measuring the unmeasurable. Enter the water clock, or clepsydra, as the Greeks would later call it. Picture a clay pot with a small hole at the bottom. Fill it with water, and the steady drip, drip, drip becomes a reliable measure of passing time. Count how long it takes to empty, and you've got a crude but functional timer. One quirky tidbit suggests that Babylonian water clocks were calibrated to match the length of ritual prayers. If a particular incantation was meant to last 3 measures, you'd know how slowly to chant by watching the water line fall. Talk about multitasking, a prayer guide and a stopwatch, all in one leaky jug. Historians still argue whether water clocks were used widely in daily life or mainly reserved for temple rituals. The evidence is tantalizing but incomplete. Clay fragments, scribal references, and later Greek descriptions that may or may not reflect Babylonian originals. Still, the concept itself is revolutionary. Time doesn't have to be seen to be measured. It can be counted, drip by drip, grain by grain. Speaking of grains, sand clocks, though more famously associated with later cultures, likely had early prototypes here too. Fine dust or sand trickling from one container to another is a natural extension of the water clock idea. And while there's no direct evidence of hourglasses in Babylon, scholars suspect the principle may have been understood. After all, Mesopotamian engineers were already controlling water for irrigation and building complex canals. It's not a leap to imagine someone turning that same ingenuity toward time. But perhaps the most profound leap the Babylonians made wasn't a tool, it was a concept. Somewhere along the line, they realized that dividing the day into equal parts was useful. And this is where things get interesting and, depending on how much coffee you've had, slightly headache-inducing. See, when you divide something, a circle, a day, a year, you need a base number. We use 10 thanks to our convenient finger count. But the Babylonians loved 60. They inherited a sexagesimal, base 60 counting system from the Sumerians, and they clung to it stubbornly, probably because 60 is a mathematical dream. It's divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, a fact that makes fractions far easier to handle in a pre-calculator world. And so a quirky decision made 4,000 years ago still dictates your life today. There are 60 minutes in an hour, 60 seconds in a minute, and 360 degrees in a circle, all echoes of Babylonian math. It's here that you start seeing the deeper implications of time measurement in this world. It's not just about knowing when to eat or pray. It's about structure, carving the day into predictable, manageable slices. Priests could plan rituals. Workers could schedule tasks. Astronomers could record celestial events against a common framework. Time became not just a natural phenomenon, but a human-made grid laid over reality. Still, the Babylonians didn't divide their day into 24 equal hours quite the way we do. Instead, they split daylight and nighttime separately into 12 parts each. That meant hours were longer in summer and shorter in winter. A slightly inconvenient system if you're trying to time a stew, but perfectly fine for tracking the sun's arc. This division wasn't arbitrary either. 12 was a sacred, symbolic number, tied to lunar cycles, zodiac signs, and the pantheon of gods. It's around now that you notice how deeply intertwined time and belief are. When the sun reaches its peak, temple drums beat. When it dips below the horizon, lamps are lit in honor of Shamash, the sun god, who retreats to the underworld. These aren't just habits, they're cosmic alignments, sacred harmonies between heaven and earth. And while the priests meticulously record every shadow and sunrise, ordinary people are adapting their lives around these patterns too. A farmer plows until his shadow reaches a certain length. A baker knows his bread is ready when the light slants through the oven's doorway just so. Time here isn't just measured, it's lived. One can't help but admire the subtle genius of it all. With no gears, no springs, and no glowing screens, the Babylonians built a society synchronized to the cosmos. The city's heartbeat, its rituals, labor, and rest pulsed in rhythm with the sun and stars. And that sense of harmony is something our digital world, with its frantic pings and endless schedules, might envy. Yet for all their sophistication, Babylonian timekeeping was still far from perfect. Clouds could obscure the sun. Seasonal changes complicated shadow readings. Water clocks leaked. And sand tended to get everywhere, including places you really didn't want sand. But each problem inspired new solutions, new observations, and new refinements. Bit by bit, the Babylonians were building a language of time written not in words, but in light and motion. And soon, that language would grow beyond the sun and shadows altogether. Soon, they would turn their gaze upward, past the bright dome of day, into the glittering darkness where time itself seemed to be written in fire. But before they could chart the stars, they needed to answer a deceptively simple question. Why 12? Why divide their world into 12 parts? And why does that number still shape ours? The answer lies deeper than mathematics, deeper even than ritual. It lies in the cosmos itself, and that's where we're heading next. You sit on a warm rooftop again, clay bricks still radiating the heat of a long Mesopotamian afternoon. The Euphrates drifts by below, sluggish and silver under the fading light. And above you, the first stars begin to prick through the indigo sky. The city is settling into its nightly rhythm. Oil lamps glow behind lattice windows. Street vendors call their final bargains. And somewhere, a temple gong sounds the evening prayers. It's a good moment to think about numbers. Specifically, one number, 12. If you've ever wondered why there are 12 hours on a clock face, 12 months in a year, 12 signs in the zodiac, or even 12 inches in a foot, you can trace that obsession with 12 back here, to this exact world of clay tablets, priest astronomers, and patient sky watchers. The Babylonians didn't just stumble onto that number, they chose it deliberately, and their reasons still ripple through your daily life thousands of years later. Let's start with the obvious. The sky itself is built around cycles. The moon waxes and wanes about 12 times between one spring and the next. The sun makes its journey across the zodiac constellations in, you guessed it, 12 distinct stages. And if you look up at the night sky long enough, you'll notice another natural division. The stars that rise just before dawn change roughly every month, completing a full cycle in a year. 12, again and again. Babylonian astronomers by the late 2nd millennium BCE had formalized the zodiac into 12 major divisions, a system later adopted and modified by the Greeks and Romans and still used in modern astrology. Each segment was tied to a particular constellation and to a period of roughly one lunar month. It was a neat, satisfying way to map the heavens and, not coincidentally, to divide the calendar too. But the 12 fixation didn't stop at months and stars. It crept into their timekeeping as well. Daylight and night were each divided into 12 parts. Not fixed hours as we think of them today, but proportional segments that stretched or shrank with the seasons. Summer hours could be longer, winter hours shorter, but the total number remained the same. Why 12 though, and not 10 or 20? Here's where Babylonian mathematics offers a clue. Their number system, inherited from the Sumerians, was based not on 10 but on 60. And 12, as it happens, divides beautifully into 60, 5 times to be exact. 60 also divides by 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, making fractions far easier to manage in a world without decimals. You might chuckle at the thought, but the reason you count 60 minutes in an hour and 360 degrees in a circle isn't because anyone calculated some cosmic truth. It's because ancient accountants and astronomers really liked numbers that divided neatly. It made everything simpler. And once that base 60 system was woven into temple ledgers, star charts, and calendar tablets, it became second nature. A quirky fact buried in the clay: Babylonian scribes sometimes wrote the number 12 with a symbol that literally combined the sign for 10 and 2. It wasn't just a number, it was a concept. 12 wasn't arbitrary, it was the building block of a cosmic order. But here's where things get even more interesting and more human. The Babylonians also linked 12 to the divine. Many of their gods were grouped into 12s. 12 major deities, 12 great temples, 12 sacred festivals across the year. Whether the math shaped the mythology or the mythology shaped the math is a chicken and egg question, and historians still argue whether religious symbolism drove their calendar or simply mirrored it. Either way, by the time of Hammurabi, the two were inseparable. Numbers weren't just tools, they were sacred language. Imagine for a moment how this would have felt. You're standing in a temple courtyard as the first light of dawn touches the ziggurat steps. A priest holds a clay tablet and chants the day's rites. You know the day will be split into 12 parts of light before darkness claims it, and then 12 parts of night before the sun returns. Time isn't a monotonous stream, but a sacred cycle, a dance with the cosmos that repeats again and again. Each 12th part brings you closer to a festival, a harvest, a new moon, or perhaps to the ominous rising of a star believed to herald the gods' displeasure. It's not hard to see how this structure gave Babylonian life a powerful sense of rhythm. Farmers didn't just work until evening, they worked until the third or fourth Beru, an old Babylonian term for a daytime segment. Merchants arranged meetings by the rising of specific stars or the midpoint of the ninth division. And priests knew exactly which hour to offer incense, which segment of night was most auspicious for a ritual. It wasn't precise the way a digital clock is, but it was consistent. Everyone shared the same cosmic schedule, even if that meant hour was a slightly elastic concept depending on the season. Now, if you're thinking, why not just split the day into 24 equal chunks? Well, so did later cultures. But in Babylon, the point wasn't to force nature into uniform slices, it was to mirror nature's rhythms. Longer summer hours felt natural because the day was longer. Shorter winter hours made sense because night did dominate. The system wasn't about control, it was about harmony. One fun little detail that's often overlooked, Babylonian star watchers didn't always start their day at sunrise. Sometimes they began their counting at sunset, marking the new day with the disappearance of the sun, a custom later echoed in Hebrew and Islamic traditions. It's a reminder that when the day begins isn't a universal truth, it's a cultural choice. And the Babylonians, as always, chose what aligned with the heavens. Historians still debate how widespread this base 12 time system was outside priestly circles. Some argue that common people likely used looser, more intuitive divisions, dawn, midday, dusk, while others believe even merchants and farmers were well aware of the 12-fold structure. What's certain is that by the Neo-Babylonian period, around the 7th century BCE, the number 12 was embedded deeply in everything from temple schedules to legal documents. And here's another curious twist. 12 wasn't just for time and space, it even found its way into measurement. Babylonian mathematicians divided circles into 360 degrees, 12 times 30, and sometimes measured distances and weights using multiples of 12 or 60. You could almost say they saw the universe itself as a vast, orderly clock, with every motion of stars, seasons, and even trade goods ticking in divine multiples. Sitting here under the Mesopotamian sky, you start to appreciate how revolutionary that is. Today, we take numbers for granted, assuming they're just neutral tools. But in Babylon, numbers were a bridge between humanity and the cosmos, proof that the universe followed patterns humans could understand, predict, and maybe even harness. And yet, for all their mathematical sophistication, the Babylonians never lost their sense of wonder. To them, the 12-fold division wasn't just clever math. It was evidence that the gods themselves had inscribed order into creation. When the sun crossed into a new zodiac house, or the moon completed its 12th cycle, it wasn't just a new month, it was a moment of cosmic significance. One last lighthearted note before we move on. Some scholars suspect that even the Babylonians' counting technique influenced their love of 12. They may have counted the 12 knuckles on one hand, excluding the thumb, while using the other hand to track dozens. A convenient, portable counting system you can try right now. Just, maybe don't do it in a meeting. People will stare. The deeper you go into this world, the more you realize that timekeeping here isn't just about knowing when. It's about understanding why. Why the seasons turn. Why the moon returns. why the stars march steadily across the night sky in their silent parade. 12 is more than a number. It's a language written into the cosmos, and the Babylonians were among the first to learn to read it. As the night deepens, the sky above you is no longer just a random scatter of stars. It's a vast celestial clock, each point of light marking the passage of time in a language as old as civilization itself. And soon, you'll see how they turned that language into something even more enduring, a calendar carved not in stone, but in the memory of the stars themselves. The night sky is fading now, washed into a soft lavender by the rising sun, and Babylon is stirring once more. Smoke curls upward from morning fires, sandals scuff along dusty streets, and the river carries its slow burden eastward. Life here is cyclical. Everything returns, everything repeats. And nowhere is that more apparent than in how the Babylonians tracked time not just by the day or the hour, but by the grander rhythm of months and years. If the daily journey of the sun gave people a sense of the present, the moon was how they measured longer stretches of time. And, as you're about to see, it was both beautifully simple and maddeningly complicated. The first principle is easy. The moon cycles through its phases about every 29.5 days. A bright, full moon grows thin and vanishes into darkness before swelling round again. To a sky-watching people like the Babylonians, this regularity was a gift. A month, from the same root as moon, was simply the time it took for the moon to complete this journey. And so, Babylonian months were born. Babylonian calendars were lunar, not solar. Each new month began with the first visible crescent after the new moon. Priests stationed on ziggurats would watch the western horizon at twilight, eyes straining for that delicate sliver of silver. When it appeared, they announced the new month, a moment often accompanied by rituals, feasts, and, naturally, a few scribes with clay tablets ready to update the official record. And for a while, it worked just fine. 12 lunar months made up a year, except, of course, they didn't. 12 lunar months add up to about 354 days, which is roughly 11 days short of a solar year. Without correction, Babylonian months would slowly drift out of sync with the seasons. A spring festival might eventually fall in the middle of winter. A harvest rite could end up before the crops were even planted. Not exactly ideal if you're trying to plan an empire's religious calendar. This is where the Babylonians' ingenuity really shines. They solved the problem with an idea that still underpins many calendars today: the intercalary month, an extra month inserted every few years to nudge the lunar calendar back into alignment with the solar year. The practice wasn't random either. Temple astronomers and royal officials would decide when the drift had grown too great, often adding an extra month every 2 or 3 years. Eventually, they refined this into a predictable cycle, a kind of early leap year system. By the 5th century BCE, the Babylonians had formalized a 19-year cycle, later known as the Metonic cycle, in which 7 extra months were added at regular intervals, a mathematical balancing act so effective that even the ancient Greeks borrowed it. Still, historians still argue whether the earliest use of intercalary months was based purely on astronomical observation or if politics played a role too. Some evidence suggests that kings might adjust the calendar to extend their reigns, align significant events with auspicious celestial signs, or even manipulate tax collection schedules. It seems that time, like most things, wasn't entirely immune to politics. And speaking of politics, the Babylonian calendar wasn't just a tool for farming or feasting, it was a tool of power. Declaring the start of a new month was a sacred duty and a royal prerogative. It wasn't something just anyone could do. The king's scribes announced it, the priests sanctified it, and the people obeyed it. Time itself was, in a sense, issued from the palace and the temple. There's a wonderfully quirky detail about these announcements. They were sometimes written on clay tablets and sent as official proclamations across the empire. Imagine receiving a government notification, not about tax laws or road repairs, but about the moon. Attention! Month of Nisanu begins tomorrow. It's bureaucracy meets astronomy, and it shows how deeply timekeeping was woven into statecraft. The names of those months, by the way, were themselves a kind of historical record. Each reflected a season, a festival, or a divine association. Nisanu, the first month, was tied to spring and renewal. Duzu, dedicated to the god Tammuz, marked the height of summer. Arahamsnu, the 8th month, was named for rituals of the dead. Through these names, the calendar wasn't just a tool, it was a story, a map of the sacred year. But if you think this system made life simpler, well, not exactly. The lunar calendar's flexibility could cause plenty of confusion. Merchants traveling from distant cities sometimes discovered their contracts were technically late because one region had added an intercalary month while another had not. Temple rituals could fall out of sync between cities. And while priests usually agreed on the appearance of the new crescent, clouds, dust storms, or simple human error could throw off the count. One fringe anecdote even suggests that on rare occasions, rival priesthoods deliberately disagreed about the moon's visibility, a sort of cosmic power struggle. If true, it's a reminder that in ancient Babylon, astronomy wasn't just science. It was politics, religion, and identity all rolled into one. Still, despite the occasional squabble, the system worked, and it worked astonishingly well. It allowed farmers to plant and harvest with confidence, ensured festivals aligned with the proper seasons, and created a shared rhythm for a sprawling and diverse empire. Even today, echoes of the Babylonian calendar survive. The Hebrew, Islamic, and traditional Chinese calendars all follow lunar or lunisolar systems with intercalary months, direct descendants of ideas first perfected on the banks of the Euphrates. There's another subtle layer to all this that's easy to miss. The calendar was also a tool for storytelling. Babylonian myths, especially their epic creation stories, were structured around cycles of time. The renewal of spring, the death and rebirth of gods, the cosmic battles that mirrored the waxing and waning of the moon. In a way, time itself became mythologized, and the calendar was a script through which the people reenacted those stories year after year. And for the priests who managed all this, it was both a sacred duty and a cosmic puzzle. Imagine standing atop a ziggurat with nothing but the naked eye, trying to predict the appearance of the new crescent with enough accuracy to plan next month's rituals. You squint into the dusty horizon, debating with your colleagues whether that faint shimmer is the moon or just atmospheric haze. One wrong call, and the city's entire religious schedule is off. Talk about pressure. Yet despite the challenges, the Babylonians did more than manage. They innovated. They began keeping detailed records of lunar cycles, noting subtle variations in the moon's motion, and building predictive models that were astonishingly precise for their time. Over centuries, those observations would evolve into sophisticated astronomical tables, the same ones that would later guide Greek and Roman astronomers, and, much later, underpin Islamic and European lunar science. One light-hearted but telling joke from a scribe's tablet sums it up nicely. The moon is never late, only the priest's eyes are. It's a glimpse into how even ancient scholars could laugh at the weight of their cosmic responsibilities. By now, you've probably noticed a pattern. The Babylonians weren't just tracking time, they were curating it, shaping it, aligning it with the cosmos, and in doing so, shaping society itself. Their calendar wasn't a passive tool. It was a framework for life, guiding the planting of fields, the scheduling of trade caravans, the timing of royal proclamations, and the choreography of the gods' festivals. And yet, as precise and orderly as it all seemed, the Babylonians knew there was more to time than the turning of the moon. Above that glowing silver disk were older, slower, and far more mysterious patterns. Patterns written not in weeks or months, but in the cold, eternal sweep of the stars. Soon, their gaze would turn upward from the lunar calendar to the celestial sphere itself. There, they would build something even more powerful, a cosmic timetable that measured not just the passing of seasons, but the very will of the gods. The ziggurat rises above Babylon like a man-made mountain, its mud brick terraces catching the first glow of dawn. At its summit, high above the noise of the streets and markets, a handful of priests stand watching the sky. They have been awake since before sunrise, not because of insomnia or idle curiosity, but because time itself is about to be measured, sanctified, and set into motion. In ancient Babylon, time was never just a neutral background against which life unfolded. It was sacred, woven into the fabric of religion, and believed to be the language through which the gods communicated their will. And those who understood that language best were not kings or merchants or scribes. They were the priests, guardians of both heaven and earth, whose task was to ensure that the rhythms of human life stayed aligned with the rhythms of the cosmos. The temple as a cosmic clock. To understand how deeply timekeeping and religion were intertwined, we have to begin with the temples themselves. Far from being mere places of worship, Babylonian temples were cosmic instruments, architectural embodiments of the universe. The ziggurat, that iconic stepped tower, was more than a monument to the gods. It was a bridge between worlds, the earthly realm below, the heavens above, and the divine domain in between. From its summit, priests observed the rising and setting of the sun, tracked the appearance of the moon, and measured the slow drift of constellations. Every terrace, every chamber, and every ritual space was designed with celestial order in mind. The most important temple in Babylon, dedicated to Marduk, the city's chief god, was called Esagila, meaning House of the Raised Head. Its towering ziggurat, Etemenanki, the foundation of heaven and earth, functioned as a literal observatory. From there, priest astronomers, known as Tupshar Enuma Anu Enlil, scribes of the Omen series, watched the skies night after night, turning the heavens into a vast, predictable clock. But these priests were not mere scientists. They were mediators. Every observation, every calculation was part of a larger religious duty, to keep the world in harmony with divine time. Daily rituals and the rhythm of the sacred. Time in Babylon was not abstract. It was embodied in ritual. The priest's day was structured around sacred routines timed to celestial events. At sunrise, offerings were made to Shamash, the sun god, whose light brought order and justice. At dusk, prayers were offered to Sin, the moon god, whose steady cycle measured the months. These daily rituals were more than acts of devotion. They were mechanisms for synchronizing the human world with cosmic order. If a sacrifice was offered at the wrong time, or a prayer recited out of season, it was believed that the gods could grow displeased, and displeased gods could mean drought, plague, or war. The precision of these ceremonies was therefore paramount. Priests measured shadows to know the hour for morning offerings. They marked the moon's phase to time monthly festivals. Even the length of a torch's burn might serve as a measure, ensuring that no rite began a moment too early or ended a moment too late. Festivals as markers of cosmic time. Beyond the daily rhythm, larger festivals anchored the year and reflected celestial cycles. The most important of these was the Akitu, or New Year festival, celebrated at the spring equinox. This was not merely a celebration of renewal, it was a cosmic reset. During Akitu, priests reenacted the creation myth, reciting the Enuma Elish and symbolically re-establishing the divine order that held chaos at bay. Other festivals followed the movements of the moon and stars. Harvest rites coincided with the appearance of certain constellations. Mourning rituals for dying gods aligned with the fading of specific stars below the horizon. The calendar itself, carefully maintained by priestly astronomers, was a sacred script, guiding the faithful through the cosmic drama of the year. It's easy to forget, in a modern world where calendars are printed on smartphones, that for the Babylonians, these festivals were not scheduled around celestial events. They were the celestial events made manifest on Earth. Time was not just measured by the heavens, it was lived according to them. Timekeeping as divine communication. To the Babylonian mind, the cosmos was a text written by the gods. Every sunrise, eclipse, or planetary conjunction was a message, and it was the priest's sacred duty to read and interpret it. This is where the boundaries between astronomy, astrology, and theology blur. The Babylonians did not distinguish between them as we do today. Observing the heavens was not a scientific hobby, it was a religious necessity. The priests' meticulous records of lunar eclipses, for example, were not just data points. They were potential omens, signs of divine favor or wrath. If a lunar eclipse occurred on the 14th day of a month, a particularly ominous timing, priests might warn the king that rebellion or invasion was imminent. In such cases, elaborate rituals could be performed to avert disaster, including the temporary enthronement of a substitute king to absorb the divine punishment before being ritually removed. This belief in celestial communication extended even to ordinary timekeeping. The hour of a birth, the timing of a military campaign, the inauguration of a temple, all were chosen based on celestial signs. Time was not a neutral container for human action. It was an active force that could bless or doom a venture depending on when it was undertaken. The priesthood's power and responsibility. This sacred role gave the priesthood enormous influence. Kings might rule cities, but priests ruled time, and by extension, the favor of the gods. Their proclamations determined when months began, when festivals occurred, and when major state decisions could be made. It's no surprise, then, that kings often sought to cultivate close relationships with temple institutions. Many rulers personally participated in New Year rituals or commissioned astronomical observations to strengthen their legitimacy. Some even claimed divine insight of their own, but none dared ignore the priest's counsel. Yet with this power came great responsibility. A miscalculated festival date or an incorrectly interpreted omen could have catastrophic consequences. A failed harvest, a lost battle, even a solar eclipse misunderstood might be blamed on priestly negligence. This pressure fueled the priesthood's relentless pursuit of accuracy, driving them to refine their methods over centuries. It's tempting to think of Babylonian priests as distant, austere figures, cloaked in ritual and mysticism. But surviving texts reveal glimpses of their human side. Some tablets record complaints about cloudy skies thwarting moon observations. Others show debates over the correct timing of festivals. There are even fragments of humor. Scribes joking about staying awake all night waiting for Venus to rise, only to miss it by moments. These glimpses remind us that, for all their sacred responsibilities, Babylon's timekeepers were people too, people grappling with the same frustrations and uncertainties we do. Their devotion to understanding time was not just an intellectual pursuit, it was a deeply human effort to find order and meaning in a vast, mysterious universe. Time as sacred order. In the end, this is perhaps the most profound lesson from Babylonian religion. Time was order. It was the thread that held heaven and earth together. To measure it was to understand the gods. To live by it was to align oneself with the cosmos, and to disrupt it was to invite chaos. Every prayer at sunrise, every festival timed to the moon, every omen read in the shifting patterns of the stars, all were acts of cosmic maintenance. The priests of Babylon were not just servants of the gods, they were caretakers of time itself, guardians of the fragile balance between the divine and the human. And yet, as meticulous as their system was, the priests knew that time stretched far beyond the rhythms of day and night, month and year. Beyond the cycles of sun and moon lay the deeper, slower motions of the stars, eternal patterns that traced the very architecture of the universe. To truly understand time, they would have to map those too. And so, night after night, they climbed the ziggurat steps, lifted their eyes to the heavens, and began to trace the cosmic story written across the stars. The night air is cooler up here, high above the streets of Babylon. The city below still hums, merchants closing their stalls, donkeys braying somewhere beyond the walls, the faint echo of a lyre drifting from a distant courtyard. But none of that matters atop the ziggurat. Up here, the noise of human life fades beneath the grander rhythm of the cosmos. Up here, time slows to the pace of the stars. You climb the final steps to the summit, a platform paved with sun-baked bricks that still hold the heat of the day. This is the sacred heart of Babylon's astronomical work. Not a modern observatory with telescopes and domes, but something far older and, in many ways, far more poetic. A temple tower turned into a cosmic watchtower. And from this height, the heavens unfold in all their meticulous, glittering precision. A tower built for the sky. The Babylonians built ziggurats for the gods, but they also built them for the sky. The towering Etemenanki, part of Marduk's great temple complex, was the most famous of these structures. Its terraces rose in layered steps, each smaller than the one below, culminating in a shrine that, according to some accounts, was painted blue to match the heavens. Historians still argue whether the top level was used exclusively for ritual or whether it doubled as an observational platform, but many scholars agree that temple towers were strategically valuable for skywatching. From up here, priests had a clear, uninterrupted view of the horizon in all directions. That was crucial because for Babylonian astronomers, the horizon wasn't just scenery, it was the starting line of cosmic measurement. When a star first appeared over that edge, when a planet disappeared beneath it, when the moon's horn rose or sank, all of these moments marked points in the heavenly calendar. And this wasn't an occasional pastime. This was nightly work, performed with a level of diligence that would make even a modern scientist proud. Clay tablets discovered in temple archives show that Babylonian observers tracked celestial events for centuries, sometimes recording a single star's appearance year after year for generations. The tools of an ancient observer. Standing on the ziggurat, you might look around for telescopes or astrolabes. You'd find none. The Babylonian astronomers' greatest tools were patience, practice, and naked eyes trained to precision over decades. They did, however, use a few simple instruments to aid their craft. A gnomon, essentially a tall stick, was often placed on the summit to measure shadows and refine solar observations. Simple sighting rods or notched measuring posts may have helped align observations with the horizon. And of course, there were the clay tablets, kept in temple libraries where every observation was meticulously recorded. Some of these tablets, like the famous Mulapin compendium, dating to around 1000 BCE, read almost like handbooks for the ancient observer. They list rising and setting times for constellations, seasonal markers, and instructions for interpreting celestial events. Mullapin even notes how certain stars rose at dawn or dusk, a practice known as heliacal rising, which helped define the agricultural calendar and ritual schedule. But perhaps the most impressive instrument was the human memory itself. Apprentices trained for years to recognize specific stars and track their slow seasonal shifts. A seasoned priest astronomer could probably identify dozens of constellations at a glance, not by their Greek or modern names, but by the mythic figures and divine signs the Babylonians saw written across the night. The sky as a record book. Watching the heavens night after night revealed patterns, and patterns were power. The Babylonians quickly realized that stars weren't scattered randomly. They moved predictably, returning to the same positions after set intervals. Some of these patterns were obvious. The sun's path along the ecliptic created the familiar cycle of seasons. The moon waxed and waned in a rhythm of about 29.5 days. But others were subtler. The regular appearance of certain constellations before dawn, the strange backward loops of wandering planets, the slow shift of star positions over centuries. Recording these changes became an obsession. Temple scribes developed entire genres of astronomical texts, such as the star lists, Mol means star in Sumerian, and omen series that linked celestial events to earthly outcomes. These weren't scientific logs in the modern sense. They often mixed careful data with myth and astrology, but they nonetheless represent some of humanity's first systematic attempts to track the heavens. And the data paid off. After centuries of watching, Babylonian observers could predict eclipses, estimate planetary cycles, and forecast the appearance of bright stars, all without ever leaving their ziggurat platforms. Historians still debate whether they fully understood why these cycles occurred, but they certainly knew that they did, and that was enough to give their kings and priests a powerful edge. A city that watched together. Although the ziggurat was the epicenter of observation, Babylonian skywatching wasn't confined to a handful of elite priests. Ordinary citizens, too, were attuned to the rhythms of the heavens. Farmers watched the heliacal rising of certain stars to know when to plant. Fishermen timed their journeys to the moon's tides. Even merchants consulted astrologers before launching trade expeditions, convinced that the alignment of Venus or Jupiter could make or break a caravan. The priesthood, however, remained the ultimate authority. Their nightly vigils produced the official celestial record, and their interpretations could influence everything from the date of a festival to the decision to go to war. A planetary conjunction might be read as a sign of divine favor. An unexpected eclipse could send the palace into panic. One quirky fact, Babylonian astronomers often worked in shifts, passing observations from one priest to another throughout the night. Some records even include notes like cloudy, could not observe, which feels surprisingly relatable to anyone who's ever canceled stargazing plans due to bad weather. The weight of the heavens. It's worth pausing to imagine what it must have felt like to stand here centuries ago, night after night, watching the same constellations wheel overhead. Without electric lights or pollution, the stars would blaze in breathtaking detail, a tapestry of cosmic order stretching from horizon to horizon. And yet, this beauty carried weight. The Babylonians believed that the heavens were not just a spectacle, but a message, a script written by the gods. Every movement mattered. A wandering planet might herald victory or doom. A dimmed star could foretell the death of a king. Historians still argue whether the priests genuinely believed in these omens or whether they used them as a political tool, but either way, the stakes were high. For the priests on the ziggurat, There was no such thing as idle sky watching. Every observation was a sacred duty, a line in the cosmic ledger. And though their instruments were simple, their conclusions were profound. The universe was orderly, predictable, and intimately connected to human fate. A legacy written in clay and starlight. Some of the clay tablets these priests left behind still exist today, sitting quietly in museums thousands of years later. They are, in many ways, the ancestors of our modern astronomical data. Not spreadsheets or graphs, but lines of cuneiform etched by candlelight, recording the slow, steady heartbeat of the cosmos. From these humble records grew the very idea of observational science. Greek astronomers like Hipparchus and Ptolemy built on Babylonian data. Roman calendars were refined with Babylonian methods. Even today, when astronomers speak of sidereal time or calculate planetary periods, they echo techniques first honed on these ancient temple towers. It's strangely comforting to think that when you glance up at Orion on a cold winter night, you're seeing the same stars a Babylonian priest once squinted at from this very platform, and perhaps muttered under his breath about staying up too late. Yes, ancient astronomers were also probably very tired. As you stand atop the ziggurat, the last stars fade and the eastern horizon begins to glow. Another Babylonian day is about to begin, and the priests will descend to record their notes, consult their omens, and prepare for another night's vigil. But the work isn't finished, far from it. If watching the fixed stars revealed cosmic order, the wandering lights, the planets, held secrets even deeper. One of them, in particular, would capture Babylon's imagination more than any other. A bright, unpredictable beacon they called the Star of Ishtar. And following its dance across the heavens would become one of the most meticulous and mystical projects of all. The night sky above Babylon is familiar yet strange. You recognize the glittering clusters scattered across the heavens, but the shapes they form are not the hunter, lion, or scorpion you grew up hearing about. Up here, names are different, stories are older, and constellations are far more than pretty patterns. They're divine signposts, each carrying meaning, power, and prophecy. You tilt your head back and try to trace one of the star groups the priests have been watching for centuries. It's not Orion to them, it's Sippachiana, the true shepherd of Anu, a celestial figure guiding the flocks of stars across the night. The great curve of Scorpius isn't a scorpion at all, but Mulgir Tab, the bite, a cosmic symbol of warning and transition. And those bright points in Taurus? They're part of Guana, the heavenly bull, a sacred beast that appears again and again in Mesopotamian myth. The sky you're staring at now is the same one you know, but told in a different language, one the Babylonians spoke fluently. The divine map above. For Babylonian astronomers, constellations weren't just convenient ways to organize the night sky. They were expressions of the cosmos' divine structure. The heavens were imagined as a carefully ordered kingdom, ruled by gods and governed by cosmic law. Each constellation wasn't just a set of stars, it was a manifestation of divine will, a heavenly symbol whose rising and setting spoke volumes about the balance between the mortal and the divine. In the Babylonian worldview, the sky was divided into three great paths or regions, each associated with a major deity. The path of Anu, the central belt of the sky, linked with order and kingship. The path of Enlil, the northern arc, associated with storms, change, and divine authority. The path of Ea, Enki, the southern sweep, tied to water, wisdom, and hidden knowledge. Each path contained its own constellations, each constellation its own deity, and each deity its own influence on the mortal world. Observing where and when these constellations appeared was therefore not just a matter of curiosity, it was a way to read the state of the cosmos itself. The Mul Apen, a star catalog older than history. Much of what we know about Babylonian constellations comes from a remarkable set of clay tablets known as the Mul Apen, literally the plow. Compiled around 1000 BCE, though likely based on older records, this text is part almanac, part astronomical guide, part mythological commentary. It lists dozens of stars and constellations, the times they rise and set, and their relationships to the seasons and agricultural cycles. Mul Apen also includes instructions on how to use certain constellations as timekeepers. For example, noting that the heliacal rising of the Pleiades signaled the start of the plowing season. These instructions tied the stars directly to the agricultural calendar, grounding cosmic observation in daily survival. But Mul Apen wasn't just practical, it was deeply symbolic. Many star names reveal connections to myths, gods, and ritual. The great twins, Lugal-Ira and Meslamta-Ea, represented twin deities linked with the underworld. The scales, Zibanitu, symbolized balance and justice. Even the Milky Way had a sacred identity. It was called the River of Heaven, possibly linked to the cosmic waters in Mesopotamian creation stories. One quirky tidbit, the Babylonians also identified a constellation they called the Jaw of the Bull, which some scholars believe might correspond to what we now call the Hyades cluster. It's a wonderfully specific and slightly unsettling image, the disembodied jaw of a celestial bovine just hanging there in the night sky. Sacred stories written in the stars. Each constellation carried its own story, many of them tied to myths that explained the world's creation and order. For instance, the heavenly bull was no ordinary animal. It was the fearsome creature unleashed by the goddess Ishtar in the Epic of Gilgamesh, sent to punish the hero for spurning her advances. When Gilgamesh and his companion Enkidu slew the bull, they symbolically reasserted human control over chaos, a story retold in the stars every time the constellation rose. Other star myths reflected the divine bureaucracy of Babylonian religion. The true shepherd of Anu was said to guide souls across the heavens, while the great twins guarded the gates of the underworld. The scorpion man, Gir-Tab-Lulu, a hybrid guardian from Mesopotamian myth, stood watch at the horizon where the sun entered the netherworld each night. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were teaching tools, memory aids, and spiritual guides, a cosmic textbook that encoded theology into the fabric of the night sky. Constellations as calendars. The Babylonians were acutely aware that the stars shifted predictably over the course of a year, and they used those shifts to measure time far beyond the daily rise and set of the sun. Each constellation's heliacal rising, the first day it appeared above the horizon just before dawn, served as a seasonal marker. For example, the rising of the constellation the Plough, Mul Apen, marked the time to begin preparing fields. The rising of the Lion signaled the heat of summer, while the appearance of the Scales indicated the arrival of the harvest season. This celestial calendar was astonishingly accurate. Babylonian farmers and priests could predict seasonal changes with remarkable precision based on star movements alone. And because the stars were so reliable, they also became vital tools for aligning the lunar calendar, which sometimes needed adjustment with extra months to stay in sync with the solar year. Historians still argue whether the Babylonians used these star markers purely for practical purposes or whether they believed the stars themselves caused the seasonal changes. It's possible they saw no real distinction between cause and effect. The rising of a constellation wasn't just a sign of change, it was the change itself, the visible expression of the gods' ongoing work in the natural world. A zodiac is born. One of Babylon's most enduring contributions to astronomy and astrology was the development of the zodiac, a band of 12 constellations that marked the sun's apparent path through the sky. Originally based on older Mesopotamian star lore, the zodiac was refined by Babylonian scholars around the 5th century BCE and later adopted and renamed by the Greeks. The zodiac was more than a calendar. It was a cosmic map of influence, with each section of the sky representing a different divine force. The Babylonians believed that the position of the sun, moon, and planets relative to these constellations could reveal the gods' intentions and shape human destiny. One of the Babylonian zodiac signs was called the Great Swallow, a constellation we now associate with part of Pisces. Another was the Field, which corresponds loosely to Virgo. These original names remind us that our modern zodiac, with its lions and scales and crabs, is really just a translation of a much older Mesopotamian sky script. The sky's living legacy. Even after millennia, many of the constellations named and mapped by Babylonian priests still guide our modern star charts. The Bull, the Twins, the Scales, the Archer, all of them began as Mesopotamian symbols, their stories carried westward by Greek astronomers and eventually woven into the constellations we recognize today. It's humbling to realize that when you open a star app on your phone or read your daily horoscope, you're engaging, however distantly, with a tradition that began here, on these dusty ziggurat platforms under the wide Mesopotamian sky. The language has changed, the names have evolved, but the stars are the same, and their patterns still measure the passage of time just as they did 4,000 years ago. A pause to look up. You lie back on the warm bricks and let your eyes wander across the darkness. The stars wheel silently overhead, each one part of a vast story that stretches beyond human memory. Somewhere in that pattern is a plow, a bull, a shepherd, a scorpion. Somewhere in that darkness are the myths of gods and kings, of harvests and floods, of life and death and everything in between. And as you drift beneath that ancient sky, you start to understand why the Babylonians spent so many sleepless nights staring upward. To them, the heavens weren't just a backdrop. They were a living manuscript, a divine calendar, a story written across eternity. And reading that story was the closest a mortal could come to touching the mind of the gods. The night sky has its rhythms, the steady, predictable march of constellations, the gentle waxing and waning of the moon. But among those ordered lights, one star refuses to sit still. It glows fiercely, brighter than almost anything else, sometimes appearing just before dawn, sometimes just after sunset, and sometimes vanishing altogether for weeks at a time. To Babylonian eyes, this was no ordinary star. This was Dilbot, the planet we now call Venus, and it was the celestial embodiment of one of their most powerful deities, Ishtar, goddess of love, war, fertility, and fate itself. When Venus rose in the morning sky, it was Ishtar the warrior, blazing ahead of the sun. When it lingered in the twilight, it was Ishtar the lover, heralding the night. And when it disappeared for days, swallowed by the glare of the sun, the Babylonians believed she was descending into the underworld, only to rise again, renewed and unstoppable. No other celestial body captured Babylonian attention or imagination quite like this brilliant wanderer. The star that comes and goes. You might think of Venus as a planet, but to the Babylonians it was a living, breathing omen. Its appearances were carefully tracked for over 1,000 years, and the records they left behind are among the oldest and most detailed astronomical logs in human history. One of the most famous examples is the Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa, a clay tablet dating back to the mid-17th century BCE. It's part of a larger collection known as the Enuma, Anu, and Lil, a series of celestial omen texts. The tablet lists Venus's first and last appearances as both a morning and evening star over a 21-year cycle. Every date, every disappearance, every reappearance. That's not just impressive dedication, that's the birth of systematic planetary observation. Venus follows an 8-year cycle in which it returns to nearly the same position in the sky on the same dates. Babylonian astronomers had figured this out long before anyone had telescopes, purely through centuries of naked-eye observation. That cycle became the backbone of many ritual calendars, royal decisions, and agricultural plans. But Venus was more than a celestial metronome. It was an omen-bearing messenger, and the Babylonians watched its every move for signs of divine will. Venus and the voice of the gods. The Babylonians believed that the heavens were the gods' way of communicating with humanity, and Venus was one of their loudest voices. A bright morning appearance might mean success in war. A delayed reappearance could foretell famine. If it vanished unexpectedly, kings might postpone coronations, or generals might abandon campaigns altogether. The omen texts often read like a cosmic weather report with life and death stakes. One example states, "If Venus disappears in the west for 3 days and then appears in the east, the king will be secure. If it remains hidden longer, the king's enemies will grow strong." A quirky tidbit, some texts even note the color of Venus at its rising, red, white, or golden, and assign specific meanings to each hue. A red Venus, for example, might signal bloodshed, while a pale one could promise peace. Historians still argue whether the priests genuinely believed these omens were literal divine messages or whether they were political tools to influence royal decisions. It's possible that both were true. The priesthood sincerely believed in cosmic communication, but also understood how to use that belief to guide and sometimes control the actions of kings. The warrior and the lover. Ishtar's dual nature, fierce and loving, nurturing and destructive, mirrored Venus's dual appearances. When the planet rose before dawn, it was called the morning star and associated with aggression, conflict, and conquest. Armies often launched campaigns during these periods, believing Ishtar's warrior aspect was on their side. When Venus appeared after sunset, it was the evening star, linked with fertility, sexuality, and abundance. Festivals honoring Ishtar's nurturing side often coincided with these appearances. Temple rituals included music, offerings, and even sacred rites intended to align human life with the rhythms of the goddess's celestial dance. The Babylonians noticed something else remarkable. Venus's disappearance wasn't random. It vanished for about 8 days before its morning rising and about 11 days before its evening return. These gaps were interpreted as Ishtar's journeys to and from the underworld, mythic narratives that mirrored astronomical reality with stunning poetic precision. Venus and the royal calendar. Tracking Venus wasn't just about religion, it was a matter of state. Babylonian kings relied heavily on the planet's cycles to plan their reigns and major political events. Royal coronations, temple dedications, and even the start of building projects were often timed to Venus's appearances, ensuring that the goddess's favor aligned with their actions. Some rulers even claimed divine legitimacy based on their connection to Ishtar. If Venus appeared on a significant date, say the anniversary of a king's ascension, it was heralded as a cosmic endorsement of their right to rule. If the planet's cycle coincided with a military campaign, the campaign was said to have Ishtar's blessing. And of course, if the omens weren't favorable, events could be postponed or adjusted. This wasn't superstition, it was strategic governance. The belief that celestial timing could influence earthly success gave kings a powerful reason to listen to their astronomers. Venus and the agricultural year. Beyond the palace walls, Venus also helped ordinary people organize their lives. Its appearances often coincided with crucial points in the agricultural year. For example, its first evening rise was linked with planting, while its disappearance sometimes marked harvest seasons. Farmers, priests, and administrators all paid close attention to these cycles to plan their work and rituals. A particularly interesting fact, in some Mesopotamian city-states, tax collection and legal deadlines were even tied to Venus's appearances. Missing a payment before the morning star rose could lead to fines, a celestial calendar literally shaping economic life. The mathematics of a goddess. The longer Babylonian astronomers watched Venus, the more precisely they understood its motions. They recognized that it followed a repeating cycle, about 584 days from one appearance in the same position to the next, and that this cycle nested neatly into an 8-year period. After 5 such synodic periods, Venus would return to nearly the same place in the sky on nearly the same date. This insight laid the groundwork for more complex astronomical models. Babylonian mathematicians began developing predictive methods for Venus's behavior, including when and where it would rise or set. By the late first millennium BCE, they were using what modern scholars call System A and System B, mathematical schemes that could forecast planetary positions with surprising accuracy. A quirky historical debate persists. Did the Babylonians truly understand Venus as a planet orbiting the sun? Or did they still think of it as a wandering star influenced by divine will? Most scholars believe they saw it as both, a physical phenomenon governed by a predictable pattern, and a divine presence revealing the god's intentions through that pattern. A light that never fades. Even today, Venus remains one of the most captivating objects in the sky. Its brilliance still turns heads, its cycle still intrigues astronomers, and its symbolism, love and war, birth and death, descent and return, still resonates across cultures. But every time you see it shimmering low on the horizon, you're also seeing it through Babylonian eyes. They were the first to track it systematically, the first to chart its dance across the heavens, the first to weave its movements into the fabric of religion, politics, and daily life. They turned a wandering light into a cosmic clock, a divine voice, and a source of meaning so powerful that echoes of it still linger in our myths, our calendars, and even our language. After all, when the Roman poet Lucifer called Venus the light bringer, he was only translating an idea the Babylonians had already understood for over 1,000 years. As you stand once more atop the ziggurat, watching that impossibly bright star sink below the horizon, you can almost feel the weight of the thousands of eyes that watched it before you. Farmers, priests, kings, and scribes, all looking to Ishtar's light for guidance, hope, and warning. And as darkness deepens and the sky settles into its slow, steady rotation, you realize that even here, among the stars, there is one constant: the human desire to find meaning in the heavens. You're lying on the flat rooftop of a mud brick house, the night air still warm from the heat of the Mesopotamian day. The Tigris is a silver ribbon in the distance, and the city around you hums quietly. A dog barking somewhere, a reed flute playing in a nearby courtyard. It's a night like any other, until it isn't. Slowly, impossibly, the full moon, bright and round and comforting, begins to darken. First a faint shadow, then a deep bite, And finally, a strange coppery glow spreads across the lunar face. You sit up. The city is awake now. People shout from rooftops, priests chant from temple courtyards, and offerings are rushed to sacred fires. This isn't just a celestial event. This is a message. Something vast and powerful is unfolding overhead, and no one wants to be on the wrong side of it. For the Babylonians, lunar eclipses weren't mere astronomical curiosities. They were terrifying, awe-inspiring, deeply consequential signs from the heavens, messages they were determined to read, interpret, and, if possible, influence. When the moon bleeds. In a world without artificial light or scientific explanations, the moon was a faithful companion, a monthly clock, a comforting guide, and a cosmic anchor. So when it suddenly changed color or disappeared, it was no small matter. The Babylonians called the moon Sin, or Nana, a powerful god who kept time, watched over kings, and marked the cycles of life. A lunar eclipse, therefore, was not just an astronomical event, it was sin in crisis. Perhaps demons were attacking him. Perhaps the gods were angry. Either way, the world below needed to pay attention. A mainstream historical fact were among the first to recognize that lunar eclipses occurred when the moon passed into Earth's shadow, aligning with the sun and Earth in a straight line. They didn't have the vocabulary of modern science, but they knew these events were predictable, not random acts of divine wrath. That didn't make them any less frightening. Eclipses were treated as omens, often heralding disaster, especially for the king. The king's dangerous month. If you think the average Babylonian farmer was anxious during an eclipse, imagine being the king. According to centuries of omen literature, lunar eclipses almost always foretold danger for the ruler, assassination, rebellion, invasion, or divine punishment. The logic was simple. As the moon governed cycles and order, its disruption signaled that order itself, especially royal order, might be under threat. One of the most fascinating and slightly theatrical Babylonian responses to this fear was the substitute king ritual, Shar Puhi. Here's how it worked. When astronomers predicted an eclipse likely to threaten the king's safety, they warned the palace. A temporary king, usually a prisoner or low-ranking official, was placed on the throne. The real king would step back, living in seclusion, while the substitute received all the bad luck aimed at the throne. After a set period, sometimes a few days, sometimes longer, the substitute was quietly removed, often executed, and the true king resumed his rule, now believed to be safe. It's dark and a bit grim, but to the Babylonians, this was cosmic problem-solving at its finest. Why suffer the wrath of the gods when someone else could take the hit? Some records suggest the substitute king and queen were given lavish treatment during their brief reign, fine clothes, feasts, even royal servants, before meeting their inevitable end. It was, in a morbid way, the most luxurious death sentence in Mesopotamia. Science in the service of safety. The Babylonians' obsession with eclipses didn't just shape rituals, it propelled their astronomical knowledge forward. Over centuries of careful observation, they noticed patterns. Eclipses tended to occur during full moons, they often repeated in cycles, and they were more likely when the moon rose near specific constellations. From these observations, they developed predictive techniques that were astonishingly accurate. By the 8th century BCE, Babylonian astronomers could forecast when and sometimes even where a lunar eclipse would occur. A mainstream example, they had identified what modern astronomers call the Saros cycle, a period of about 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours after which similar eclipses occur. Although they didn't know why the pattern existed, they used it effectively to prepare rituals and warn kings. Historians still argue whether Babylonian priests fully understood the geometry behind eclipses or if they simply recognized recurring numerical patterns. Either way, their predictive abilities were centuries ahead of their time and often rivaled the capabilities of early Greek and even Renaissance astronomers. Eclipses and empire. Eclipses weren't just cosmic curiosities, they were political events. Kings would delay wars, cancel ceremonies, or issue proclamations based on eclipse omens. If an eclipse predicted rebellion, spies were sent to sniff out conspiracies. If it warned a foreign invasion, borders were reinforced. Some rulers even used eclipses as propaganda. A well-timed omen could be spun as proof of divine favor or a sign that enemies were doomed. The stars weren't just telling the future, they were shaping it. A fascinating case involves King Esarhaddon of Assyria, a successor state heavily influenced by Babylonian astronomy. Before one particularly ominous eclipse, he placed a substitute king and went into hiding. When nothing bad happened, he declared the gods had personally protected him, strengthening his divine mandate. The people's response. While kings worried about assassins and priests worried about omens, ordinary Babylonians had their own responses to eclipses, mostly centered on ritual noise. It was common for people to shout, bang drums, and clash pots during an eclipse, hoping to scare away whatever was attacking the moon. Others offered food or incense to Sin, pleading for his safe return. A quirky note, some households even covered water jars during an eclipse, fearing that the moon's corrupted light might poison the water. Others avoided eating or drinking altogether until the event passed. For the average Babylonian, this wasn't science, it was participation in the cosmic drama unfolding overhead. The mythic layer. No Babylonian explanation of eclipses was complete without myth. In one version, the moon god Sin was attacked by demons or chaotic forces whenever he grew too powerful, plunging the heavens into temporary darkness. In another, the eclipse represented a cosmic trial, with Sin passing through the underworld's shadow to emerge reborn and strengthened. These stories didn't contradict the astronomical observations. They complemented them. The priests could calculate an eclipse to the day, but they still told myths to explain why it happened. Science and story, fact and faith coexisted without conflict. Shadows that still speak. It's easy, from our modern perspective, to see eclipses as simple geometry, predictable alignments of rock, light, and shadow. But to the Babylonians, they were far more than that. They were moments when the fabric of the universe rippled, when God spoke directly to humanity, when fate itself could be glimpsed in the darkening sky. Their meticulous records of eclipses, stretching across centuries, influenced every major civilization that followed. The Greeks learned from them. The Persians and Romans consulted their omen texts. Even medieval Islamic astronomers built on Babylonian eclipse data when refining their own models. And perhaps most remarkable of all, some of those same eclipse cycles they identified over 2,500 years ago are still used by astronomers today. The Saros cycle remains a reliable tool for predicting when the next lunar eclipse will occur. You lie back again on that rooftop, the moon now a dull red orb. Around you, the city has quieted. The priests' chants have softened, the fires burn low, and people gaze upward in reverent silence. They know the light will return, it always does. But for now, they let the mystery wash over them, a reminder that even in a universe they've learned to measure and predict, there will always be room for wonder, for fear, and for stories that reach beyond reason. And as the shadow slowly slips away and sin returns in all his silver glory, you can't help but feel a strange kinship with those long-ago stargazers. People who, like you, once looked up at a darkened moon and tried to make sense of the universe. You step forward into the slow dawn of a new era. The ziggurats still loom behind you in memory, their stairways to the heavens, their priests with clay tablets and reed styluses, their kingly rituals of cosmic order. But beyond the rivers of Mesopotamia, the world is changing. Empires rise and fall. The torch of knowledge passes from hand to hand. And though Babylon's own walls will crumble, its ideas, well, those are far more stubborn. They travel, they adapt, they endure. And as you blink awake into the world of Greece and Rome, you begin to see something extraordinary. The Babylonians never truly vanished. Their way of measuring time, reading the heavens, and finding meaning in the stars quietly shaped the foundations of Western science, even if most of the later thinkers didn't know they were standing on Babylonian shoulders. The disappearing act that wasn't. Babylon itself faded after centuries of greatness. The Persians conquered it in 539 BCE, and later the Greeks under Alexander took their turn. Eventually, the city became a provincial backwater, its once glorious temples crumbling, its libraries buried under centuries of dust. But Babylonian scholars had been meticulous record keepers. They filled thousands of clay tablets with observations, predictions, and mathematical schemes for tracking planets and eclipses. These weren't just lists of dates and events. They were systems of understanding, built on centuries of patient observation. And because they were written in cuneiform on durable clay, they endured long after the empire that created them vanished. Archaeologists have uncovered tens of thousands of astronomical tablets from Babylonian libraries, some dating from as late as the 1st century BCE, long after the city had lost political power. These records were studied and copied by later cultures, especially the Greeks. A quirky tidbit: one Babylonian astronomer named Nabu-Ramani is cited in Greek texts centuries after his death, a kind of ancient celebrity scientist whose name became shorthand for a whole tradition of celestial knowledge. Historians still argue whether this transmission happened directly, through Greek scholars visiting Mesopotamia, or indirectly, through Persian intermediaries. But what's clear is that Babylon's stargazing legacy did not stop at its own horizon. The Greek Awakening. By the time of the classical Greeks, astronomy had become a serious intellectual pursuit. Thinkers like Thales, Anaximander, and later Aristotle pondered the nature of the cosmos. But when it came to practical, day-to-day sky watching, they leaned heavily on Babylonian methods. The most famous case is that of Hipparchus, a 2nd century BCE Greek astronomer often called the father of astronomy. Hipparchus didn't start from scratch. He had access to centuries of Babylonian eclipse records, which he used to refine his calculations of the lunar cycle and even discover the phenomenon of precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis. A mainstream fact. Hipparchus explicitly referenced Babylonian eclipse data spanning 600 years. Without their precise records, his mathematical models would have been impossible. Some scholars believe Hipparchus's discovery of precession may have been anticipated by Babylonian astronomers themselves. Though being more practical than theoretical, they never framed it in Greek geometric terms. Historians still argue whether the Babylonians noticed precession and simply didn't record it as such. But it wasn't just data. The Greeks adopted Babylonian ideas wholesale, including the division of the zodiac into 12 signs, each covering 30 degrees of the ecliptic. This system, deeply rooted in Mesopotamian star lore, became the backbone of Hellenistic astronomy and astrology alike. Astrology, Babylon's most persistent export. And speaking of astrology, if you've ever read a horoscope, you're essentially participating in one of Babylon's longest-lasting exports. The Babylonians didn't invent the idea that celestial events influenced human affairs, but they systematized it like no one before. Their Enuma Anu Enlil, a massive compendium of celestial omens, cataloged hundreds of planetary phenomena and their supposed earthly consequences. A red glow on Mars? War. A bright Venus at dawn? Good fortune for the king. When the Greeks encountered these texts, they didn't scoff, they adapted. They combined Babylonian omen lore with their own philosophical frameworks, transforming astrology from a royal advisory tool into a full-blown cosmic science. A mainstream fact: by the 4th century BCE, Babylonian-style astrology had become deeply embedded in Greek intellectual culture, with philosophers like Plato and Aristotle referencing celestial influence on earthly life. Some Greek astrologers tried to rationalize Babylonian predictions by linking them to natural forces, suggesting, for instance, that the moon's phases affected human behavior much like tides. Historians still argue whether this was genuine science or just an attempt to give astrology a philosophical makeover. The Babylonians' influence wasn't limited to star charts and horoscopes. It extended to how time itself was organized. Their base 60 system, which divided the hour into 60 minutes and the minute into 60 seconds, was adopted by the Greeks and eventually the Romans. And from there, it spread across the Western world. Even the concept of a luni-solar calendar, based on both the moon's phases and the solar year, came straight from Mesopotamia. Greek city-states used similar systems, complete with intercalatory months to keep the seasons aligned. The Romans, never ones to ignore a good idea, followed suit, although their early attempts were famously chaotic. Looking at you, pre-Julian calendar. A mainstream fact: the Babylonians' Metonic cycle, a 19-year pattern in which lunar and solar calendars realign, was fully adopted by Greek astronomers and later informed the Roman calendar reforms under Julius Caesar. Even the word month comes from the same root as moon, a linguistic fossil of that ancient Babylonian impulse to measure time by the sky. Historians still argue whether the Romans truly understood the math behind these cycles or simply borrowed the tables wholesale. From Alexandria to Baghdad, a hidden thread. Fast forward a few centuries, and Babylon's fingerprints are still everywhere. In the Hellenistic world, the Great Library of Alexandria housed astronomical texts that traced their lineage back to Mesopotamian scribes. In the Islamic Golden Age, scholars in Baghdad and Damascus pored over Greek and Persian manuscripts, many of which contained Babylonian material in disguised form. A mainstream fact: the great Islamic astronomer al-Battani, 9th to 10th century CE, refined planetary models that ultimately rested on Babylonian observation techniques. His work, in turn, influenced Copernicus, yes, that Copernicus, more than 500 years later. Even the names of the planets in Arabic star charts often trace their lineage to Babylonian deity names: Ishtar, Venus, Nergal, Mars, and so on. Historians still argue whether this continuity was conscious reverence or just the inertia of tradition. The birth of scientific astronomy. By the time of the European Renaissance, the old Babylonian clay tablets were long forgotten, buried beneath layers of dust and conquest. And yet, their logic still pulsed beneath the surface of European science. Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, all of them relied on astronomical frameworks that had evolved from Babylonian methods. The base 60 system still governed their measurements. The zodiac still mapped the ecliptic. The idea of the cosmos as a predictable, measurable clockwork, that too was a Babylonian inheritance, stripped of its mythic language, but alive in its mathematical precision. A mainstream fact, Johannes Kepler, while formulating his laws of planetary motion, explicitly cited ancient planetary period tables derived from Mesopotamian sources via Greek intermediaries. Even the design of mechanical clocks in the Middle Ages, with their division into 12 hours and 60-minute intervals, reflects the silent influence of a culture that had been gone for nearly 2 millennia. Historians still argue whether this was conscious homage or simple historical momentum. Echoes in the everyday. And now here you are, in the 21st century, glancing at the time on your phone. The numbers ticking by, 60 seconds to a minute, 60 minutes to an hour, are Babylon's fingerprints. The months you plan your life around, the zodiac signs people joke about on social media, the leap days that keep our calendars on track, all of them are echoes of a world that measured time with sundials and clay tablets. The Babylonians might not recognize our telescopes or atomic clocks, but they'd understand the logic behind them. They'd nod knowingly at our obsession with counting days, predicting eclipses, and assigning meaning to the movements of planets. They'd probably chuckle that we still name our days after celestial bodies, Sunday, Monday, just as they once did. And maybe they'd be pleased, because although Babylon the city has long been dust, Babylon the idea, the notion that the universe is knowable, measurable, and deeply connected to human life, still hums quietly in the machinery of our days. The rivers of Mesopotamia may no longer flow as they once did, but their reflections are still there, mirrored in every ticking clock, every midnight horoscope, every leap year correction. Babylon didn't die, it just changed address. You're standing in a grand courtyard in Babylon, the smell of incense clinging to the warm night air, the sound of drums rolling softly from the temple precinct. Overhead, the moon is nearly full. Venus is blazing low on the horizon, and the stars wheel predictably above the ziggurat. But this isn't just another night of stargazing. Tonight, the king himself will appear before the people, not just as a man, but as a bridge between earth and sky, between human time and cosmic time. And here's the truth. In Babylon, time wasn't just measured, it was wielded. To control the calendar, to interpret the heavens, to predict the movements of the gods, all of this was power. And nobody understood that better than the kings who ruled beneath those ancient skies. The king as cosmic conductor. In Mesopotamia, kingship was never just a political office. It was a sacred duty, a divine mandate. The king's job wasn't only to govern people or collect taxes. It was to maintain order in the universe, a concept the Babylonians called kittam umisharam, truth and justice, but also cosmic balance. And that balance was measured in time. The movements of the sun and moon, the rising of the constellations, the turning of the seasons, all were signs of cosmic order. If they went unobserved, unmarked, or unhonored, the boundary between chaos and civilization might collapse. So kings poured resources into astronomy not simply to satisfy curiosity, but to prove they could keep the universe in harmony. Babylonian kings regularly boasted in inscriptions about setting the calendar aright or restoring the order of the heavens. These weren't metaphors. When the lunar calendar drifted out of sync with the agricultural year, the king personally authorized the insertion of an extra month, literally realigning human time with cosmic time. Calendar power and political control. Controlling the calendar wasn't just a sacred duty, it was a brilliant political tool. If you can decide when the year begins, you control when taxes are due, when soldiers are conscripted, when festivals occur. You control the rhythm of life itself. That's why many kings took a hands-on approach to timekeeping. Some even consulted temple astronomers directly before declaring a new year. And if the stars or omens suggested that a particular month was unlucky, they could rename it, rearrange it, or extend it. Time wasn't a fixed, neutral backdrop. It was something the king shaped to his will. A quirky tidbit: in one surviving royal decree, a Babylonian king postponed the New Year's festival, Akitu, because a lunar eclipse had occurred just before it, a sign that the timing was inauspicious. The entire city waited weeks before celebrating, all because the heavens said not yet. Historians still argue whether these adjustments were driven more by practical necessity to keep lunar and solar cycles aligned, or by political calculation. The answer, as usual, is probably both. The Akitu Festival, cosmic renewal on a schedule. If there was one event that revealed the king's cosmic role most clearly, it was the Akitu, the Babylonian New Year festival. Held at the spring equinox, if the stars permitted, Akitu wasn't just a celebration. It was a ritual reboot of the cosmos. For 12 days, the city reenacted the creation myth, re-establishing order from chaos. The high priest recited the Enuma Elish, the epic of Marduk's victory over the primordial sea. Statues of the gods were paraded through the streets, and at the center of it all stood the king. Here's the twist: the king was publicly stripped of his regalia and slapped by the high priest, a humbling act meant to symbolize his dependence on the god's favor. Only after he swore that he had ruled justly and maintained the cosmic order was his crown returned to him. If the king wept during the ritual, and many did, it was considered a sign that Marduk still approved of his reign. The Akitu's timing depended on the accurate observation of the equinox and the lunar calendar. If astronomers miscalculated, or if the king ignored their advice, the entire ritual could fall out of cosmic alignment. And if the cosmos slipped out of alignment, so did the king's legitimacy. Omens and authority. The king's relationship with the heavens wasn't just about calendars, it was also about omens. Babylonian omen texts are filled with statements like, "If Jupiter rises in the month of Nisanu, the king will have peace," or "If a lunar eclipse occurs on the 14th day, the king's enemies will conspire." These weren't just predictions, they were political realities. If the stars said rebellion was coming, the king might raise additional troops. If they promised prosperity, he might launch a building program. A quirky historical example: one Assyrian king, inheriting Babylonian traditions, reportedly delayed a major military campaign by 3 months because Mars was in an unfavorable position, and only marched once the red star shifted, convinced that Ishtar now favored victory. Sometimes kings even manipulated omen interpretations to justify decisions they had already made. Historians still argue whether royal astrologers believed their own predictions or used them strategically to reinforce royal authority. Again, the truth likely lies in the middle, belief and politics intertwined, each reinforcing the other. Time and divine legitimacy. Kings also used celestial timing to link themselves directly with the gods. Many royal inscriptions emphasize that the king's reign coincided with auspicious astronomical events, a solar eclipse, a rare planetary alignment, or a particularly bright comet. One inscription from King Nabonidus boasts that his rise to power was heralded by a sign in the heavens, almost certainly a recorded eclipse. Another ruler described himself as chosen under the bright eye of Marduk, referring to a particularly dazzling appearance of Jupiter. In each case, the message was the same, the heavens themselves approved this king. His rule wasn't just lawful, it was cosmically ordained. Babylonian kings frequently commissioned foundation inscriptions for temples or palaces, precisely dated according to celestial events. These inscriptions were meant to show future generations that the king's deeds were not only monumental, but cosmically timed. When time turned against the throne, but the heavens could also turn hostile. A badly timed eclipse, a comet in the wrong constellation, or an unseasonable flood could all be read as signs that the king's reign was faltering. When this happened, panic spread, not just among the people, but in the palace itself. That's when rituals like the substitute king ceremony, which you met in the previous section, came into play. These weren't superstitions, they were political survival strategies. If the gods were angry, you did something, anything, to show that the cosmic order was still under control. A quirky detail, some kings, facing a barrage of bad omens, went so far as to change their regnal year names, essentially rewriting time to distance themselves from disaster. It's as if a modern leader tried to erase 2020 from the calendar because too many bad things happened that year. The king, the clock, and the cosmos. In Babylon, the king's legitimacy was a three-legged stool: earthly power, divine favor, and cosmic order. Lose any one of those and the stool collapsed. But as long as the stars aligned and the calendar stayed true, the king's power felt eternal, as regular as the rising sun, as predictable as the turning seasons. And in many ways, that's exactly how kings wanted their people to see them. Just as time flowed in cycles, so too did kingship. Each new year renewed it. Each festival reaffirmed it. Each observed star was proof that the universe still ran according to divine will, and that the king was the keeper of that will on earth. Historians still argue whether Babylonian kings truly saw themselves as cosmic agents, or whether this was clever political theater. But maybe the distinction doesn't matter. For the people who lived beneath that vast Mesopotamian sky, the king and the cosmos were part of the same story. As you leave the temple courtyard, the drums fade into the distance, and the sky stretches endlessly above you. The same stars, the same planets, the same slow-turning clock the Babylonians once read for signs of destiny. And you realize that for them, power wasn't just about armies or palaces. It was about aligning human life with the deep, unchanging rhythms of the universe, and convincing everyone that the king's heartbeat pulsed in time with the stars. You step forward into the slow dawn of a new era. The ziggurats still loom behind you in memory, their stairways to the heavens, their priests with clay tablets and reed styluses, their kingly rituals of cosmic order. But beyond the rivers of Mesopotamia, the world is changing. Empires rise and fall, the torch of knowledge passes from hand to hand. And though Babylon's own walls will crumble, its ideas, well, those are far more stubborn. They travel, they adapt, they endure. And as you blink awake into the world of Greece and Rome, you begin to see something extraordinary. The Babylonians never truly vanished. Their way of measuring time, reading the heavens, and finding meaning in the stars quietly shaped the foundations of Western science, even if most of the later thinkers didn't know they were standing on Babylonian shoulders. But Babylonian scholars had been meticulous record keepers. They filled thousands of clay tablets with observations, predictions, and mathematical schemes for tracking planets and eclipses. These weren't just lists of dates and events, they were systems of understanding built on centuries of patient observation. And because they were written in cuneiform on durable clay, they endured long after the empire that created them vanished. Archaeologists have uncovered tens of thousands of astronomical tablets from Babylonian libraries, some dating from as late as the 1st century BCE, long after the city had lost political power. These records were studied and copied by later cultures, especially the Greeks. A quirky tidbit: one Babylonian astronomer named Nabu Rimonini is cited in Greek texts centuries after his death, a kind of ancient celebrity scientist whose name became shorthand for a whole tradition of celestial knowledge. Historians still argue whether this transmission happened directly, through Greek scholars visiting Mesopotamia, or indirectly, through Persian intermediaries. But what's clear is that Babylon's stargazing legacy did not stop at its own horizon. The Greek Awakening. By the time of the classical Greeks, astronomy had become a serious intellectual pursuit. Thinkers like Thales, Anaximander, and later Aristotle pondered the nature of the cosmos. But when it came to practical, day-to-day skywatching, they leaned heavily on Babylonian methods. The most famous case is that of Hipparchus, a 2nd century BCE Greek astronomer often called the father of astronomy. Hipparchus didn't start from scratch. He had access to centuries of Babylonian eclipse records, which he used to refine his calculations of the lunar cycle and even discover the phenomenon of precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis. A mainstream fact: Hipparchus explicitly referenced Babylonian eclipse data spanning 600 years. Without their precise records, his mathematical models would have been impossible. Some scholars believe Hipparchus's discovery of precession may have been anticipated by Babylonian astronomers themselves, though, being more practical than theoretical, they never framed it in Greek geometric terms. Historians still argue whether the Babylonians noticed precession and simply didn't record it as such. But it wasn't just data. The Greeks adopted Babylonian ideas wholesale, including the division of the zodiac into 12 signs, each covering 30 degrees of the ecliptic. This system, deeply rooted in Mesopotamian star lore, became the backbone of Hellenistic astronomy and astrology alike. Astrology, Babylon's most persistent export. And speaking of astrology, if you've ever read a horoscope, you're essentially participating in one of Babylon's longest-lasting exports. The Babylonians didn't invent the idea that celestial events influenced human affairs, but they systematized it like no one before. Their Enuma Anu Enlil, a massive compendium of celestial omens, cataloged hundreds of planetary phenomena and their supposed earthly consequences. A red glow on Mars? War. A bright Venus at dawn? Good fortune for the king. When the Greeks encountered these texts, they didn't scoff, they adapted. They combined Babylonian omen lore with their own philosophical frameworks, transforming astrology from a royal advisory tool into a full-blown cosmic science. A mainstream fact: by the 4th century BCE, Babylonian-style astrology had become deeply embedded in Greek intellectual culture, with philosophers like Plato and Aristotle referencing celestial influence on earthly life. Some Greek astrologers tried to rationalize Babylonian predictions by linking them to natural forces, suggesting, for instance, that the moon's phases affected human behavior much like tides. Historians still argue whether this was genuine science or just an attempt to give astrology a philosophical makeover. Timekeeping and calendars in the Roman world. The Babylonians' influence wasn't limited to star charts and horoscopes. It extended to how time itself was organized. Their base 60 system, which divided the hour into 60 minutes and the minute into 60 seconds, was adopted by the Greeks and eventually the Romans, and from there it spread across the Western world. Even the concept of a lunisolar calendar, based on both the moon's phases and the solar year, came straight from Mesopotamia. Greek city-states used similar systems, complete with intercalary months to keep the seasons aligned. The Romans, never ones to ignore a good idea, followed suit, although their early attempts were famously chaotic, looking at you pre-Julian calendar. A mainstream fact: the Babylonians' Metonic cycle, a 19-year pattern in which lunar and solar calendars realign, was fully adopted by Greek astronomers and later informed the Roman calendar reforms under Julius Caesar. Even the word month comes from the same root as moon, a linguistic fossil of that ancient Babylonian impulse to measure time by the sky. Historians still argue whether the Romans truly understood the math behind these cycles or simply borrowed the tables wholesale. From Alexandria to Baghdad, a hidden thread. Fast forward a few centuries, and Babylon's fingerprints are still everywhere. In the Hellenistic world, the Great Library of Alexandria housed astronomical texts that traced their lineage back to Mesopotamian scribes. In the Islamic Golden Age, scholars in Baghdad and Damascus pored over Greek and Persian manuscripts, many of which contained Babylonian material in disguised form. A mainstream fact: the great Islamic astronomer al-Battani, 9th–10th century CE, refined planetary models that ultimately rested on Babylonian observation techniques. His work, in turn, influenced Copernicus, yes, that Copernicus, more than 500 years later. Even the names of the planets in Arabic star charts often trace their lineage to Babylonian deity names: Ishtar, Venus, Nergal, Mars, and so on. Historians still argue whether this continuity was conscious reverence or just the inertia of tradition. The birth of scientific astronomy. By the time of the European Renaissance, the old Babylonian clay tablets were long forgotten, buried beneath layers of dust and conquest. And yet, their logic still pulsed beneath the surface of European science. Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, all of them relied on astronomical frameworks that had evolved from Babylonian methods. The base 60 system still governed their measurements. The zodiac still mapped the ecliptic. The idea of the cosmos as a predictable, measurable clockwork, that too was a Babylonian inheritance, stripped of its mythic language, but alive in its mathematical precision. A mainstream fact: Johannes Kepler, while formulating his laws of planetary motion, explicitly cited ancient planetary period tables derived from Mesopotamian sources via Greek intermediaries. Even the design of mechanical clocks in the Middle Ages, with their division into 12 hours and 60-minute intervals, reflects the silent influence of a culture that had been gone for nearly 2 millennia. Historians still argue whether this was conscious homage or simple historical momentum. Echoes in the everyday. And now here you are, in the 21st century, glancing at the time on your phone. The numbers ticking by, 60 seconds to a minute, 60 minutes to an hour, are Babylon's fingerprints. The months you plan your life around, the zodiac signs people joke about on social media, the leap days that keep our calendars on track, all of them are echoes of a world that measured time with sundials and clay tablets. The Babylonians might not recognize our telescopes or atomic clocks, but they'd understand the logic behind them. They'd nod knowingly at our obsession with counting days, predicting eclipses, and assigning meaning to the movements of planets. They'd probably chuckle that we still name our days after celestial bodies, Sunday, Monday, just as they once did. And maybe they'd be pleased, because although Babylon the city has long been dust, Babylon the idea, the notion that the universe is knowable, measurable, and deeply connected to human life, still hums quietly in the machinery of our days. The rivers of Mesopotamia may no longer flow as they once did, but their reflections are still there, mirrored in every ticking clock, every midnight horoscope, every leap year correction. Babylon didn't die, it just changed address. The night still hangs heavy over Babylon, that peculiar velvet darkness just before dawn. A cool breeze drifts across the rooftops, carrying the faint scent of wet clay and river reeds from the Euphrates below. And there you are, standing barefoot atop a ziggurat, stylus tucked behind your ear, squinting at a patch of stars you've come to know like the back of your hand. This is your life now, not as a king or a soldier or a merchant, but as a sky watcher, one of the scholarly priests whose job it is to track the heavens, measure the passage of time, and keep the great clock of the cosmos running on schedule. It's not glamorous, not heroic, and definitely not easy on your sleep schedule. But in Babylon, few callings are more vital. Dawn, the end of the night shift. Your day, or rather your night, often begins when others are fast asleep. Most nights you climb the temple tower hours before sunrise, long after the city's noisy streets have gone quiet. Wrapped in a thin wool cloak against the chill, you step onto the rooftop platform with its broad, flat stones, each etched with faint chalk lines pointing toward the horizon. The work starts with a slow sweep of the sky. You watch the familiar constellations tilt westward. You note the phase of the moon, its glow faint against the deep indigo. Venus, bright as a lantern, is just starting to rise. You scratch its position into a damp clay tablet, careful to mark the angle and timing precisely. A mainstream historical fact recorded such observations night after night for centuries, accumulating data that modern scientists still marvel at today. Their measurements of Venus's appearances were so precise that they could predict its rising and setting to within a day, even decades in advance. A quirky tidbit: many of these observations were carried out in pairs. One priest to watch the heavens, the other to read prayers and fend off evil omens. After all, staring too long into the stars was thought to attract unwanted cosmic attention. Historians still argue whether the assistant priest truly believed he was protecting his colleague from celestial misfortune, or whether he was mostly there to double-check the math, which, frankly, is the more terrifying part. Morning, reporting to the temple. By the time the first hints of dawn stain the eastern sky, your clay tablets are filled with numbers and notes. It's time to shuffle down the steep steps of the ziggurat and deliver your findings to the temple scribes. Inside the dim halls, rows of other astronomers, some older, some barely apprentices, are already at work. The room smells of oil lamps and drying clay. A low hum of murmured calculations fills the air as tablets are sorted, copied, and cataloged. You hand yours to a senior priest who squints at the cuneiform and nods approvingly. Later, these numbers will be added to massive series, centuries-long records of the planets, the moon, eclipses, and even rare comets. Together, they form a cosmic diary that stretches back further than any living memory. These archives were so central to Babylonian culture that many temples maintained observational logs spanning over 800 years. A quirky note: some priests became minor celebrities for particularly accurate predictions. One man supposedly gained a free lifetime supply of temple beer after correctly forecasting a total lunar eclipse 3 years in advance, the ancient equivalent of nailing a weather forecast for a century from now. Historians still argue whether these records were used purely for religious rituals or whether they had more practical applications, like agricultural planning or navigation. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, because in Babylon, nothing cosmic stayed purely spiritual for long. Midday. Calculations and calendars. Once the morning rituals are done and the temple courtyard fills with chatter and traders and goats bleating in the heat, you move into the quieter, dustier chambers of the astronomers. This is where the real head-scratching begins. You sit cross-legged on a woven mat, fresh clay tablets arrayed before you. Using a stylus, you begin calculating planetary cycles. Jupiter, for example, appears in roughly the same place in the sky every 12 years, a coincidence that feels suspiciously divine. The moon completes its cycle in about 29 and a half days. You check your tables against last night's observations, adjusting predictions for the next month. A mainstream fact: Babylonian astronomers used arithmetical methods, not geometry, like the Greeks would later do, to calculate celestial events. They recognized repeating cycles and created predictive step functions to forecast planetary positions. Some scholars believe the Babylonians invented a form of proto-algebra just to keep track of complex lunar cycles. Imagine explaining to your neighbors that you invented math because the moon was being inconvenient. Historians still argue whether these calculations were purely mathematical insights or whether they were wrapped up in mystical interpretations. Many cuneiform tablets switch seamlessly between numeric tables and omen texts, as if to say, yes, this is math, but it's also magic. Afternoon. Royal business. Around midday, a temple messenger might arrive with a wax-sealed tablet from the palace. The king's astrologers want a report. When will the next lunar eclipse occur? Will Venus be bright enough to herald a good omen for the upcoming harvest? You and your colleagues huddle over the tablets, poring over the numbers. An answer is scratched into a fresh tablet and dispatched back to the royal court. Here's the reality. For all your nights spent gazing upward, much of your job revolves around earthly power. Kings base decisions, wars, marriages, temple dedications on your predictions. If your calculations are wrong, people could panic, armies could falter, and harvests could fail. A mainstream fact: Babylonian kings routinely consulted astronomers before major political actions, especially wars and coronations. A quirky note: at least one king reportedly delayed a coronation by 2 months because Mars, associated with blood and war, was too bright, and then thanked the astronomers when his enemies conveniently fell ill during the delay. Historians still argue whether these royal consultations were genuine belief in celestial influence or clever political theater to legitimize decisions. Likely, it was both, with a dash of superstition sprinkled in for good measure. Evening, teaching the next generation. As the sun sinks low and the city cools, the ziggurat's shadow stretches long across the rooftops. Your duties aren't over yet. The next generation of skywatchers waits in a small courtyard, wax tablets balanced on their knees, eager, or pretending to be, to learn the art of measuring the heavens. You draw diagrams in the sand, lunar phases, planetary paths, the slow creep of the equinox. You quiz them on the names of stars and the omens they carry. You make them memorize the months, the cycles, the rare but vital events that might occur once in a lifetime. Babylonian astronomical education was rigorous and lifelong. Apprentice scribes spent years copying old tablets before being trusted with original observations. A quirky detail: teachers often used mnemonic songs to help students memorize complex planetary cycles. Imagine chanting 29.5 days, 18.6 years, 223 months in a sing-song voice, ancient science set to music. Historians still argue whether the temple schools were strictly priestly institutions or whether lay scholars could also study astronomy. Some evidence suggests merchant families sponsored their sons' education in hopes of better predicting trade winds or seasonal markets. Night, back to the roof. And then, as darkness creeps back across the sky, your day, or rather your night, begins again. You climb the ziggurat stairs once more, the steps worn smooth by centuries of astronomers before you. The stars greet you like old friends. There's Mars, stubbornly red and bright. There's Jupiter, inching forward on its stately path. The moon has shifted slightly since last night, just as your calculations said it would. You jot down the changes, cross-check your numbers, and settle in for another long vigil under the heavens. It's repetitive work. It's exhausting. And sometimes it feels futile. After all, the stars don't need you to keep shining. But deep down, you know why you do it. Because without these observations, the temple rituals falter. Without the calendar, the crops go unplanted. Without the omens, the king hesitates. Without the measured heartbeat of the cosmos, Babylon itself loses its rhythm. And maybe, if you're honest, you do it for yourself too. There's something profoundly comforting about knowing that amid all the chaos and noise of the human world, the heavens keep their steady, silent pace. Stars rise, planets wander, seasons turn. And you, a humble priest with a stylus and a tablet, are part of that eternal dance. As the night deepens, you lean against the cool stone of the temple parapet and let your eyes drift skyward. The same constellations your ancestors charted still shine above you. The same patterns still unfold. And though Babylon may one day fall, and empires yet unborn will rise in its place, your work will echo across millennia, written not in clay, but in the stars themselves. The stars are steady. They do not lie. They rise and set with mechanical precision, and their rhythms are as old as time itself. But humans, humans are another story. We misread. We overinterpret. We make wild guesses and call them wisdom. And for all the brilliant work Babylonian skywatchers accomplished, they were still human, fallible, biased, and sometimes hilariously wrong. If the previous sections painted them as the tireless keepers of cosmic order, this one shows a more honest picture. Ingenious minds working in the dark, making mistakes, correcting them, arguing about them, and occasionally clinging to ideas that today make us scratch our heads. And yet, it's precisely those errors, debates, and revisions that made Babylonian astronomy so resilient and so influential. The problem of imperfect records. You might assume that after centuries of nightly observation, the Babylonians had the cosmos neatly mapped out. Not quite. Their clay tablets, as precise as they often were, also reveal a surprising number of errors, contradictions, and guesswork. For one thing, recording planetary movements is harder than it sounds. Mars sometimes loops backward in the sky, a phenomenon we call retrograde motion, and to ancient astronomers this was maddening. Tables predicting its position might be off by days or even weeks. A bright star cataloged one year might appear slightly off the next, leading to heated debates over who had written the real position correctly. Surviving Babylonian astronomical texts often include scribal corrections, with lines scratched out, overwritten, or annotated with phrases like revised according to observation. This shows they knew mistakes happened, and that they actively tried to fix them. A quirky tidbit. Some tablets even include complaints from one astronomer about another's poor handwriting or sloppy calculations. One frustrated scribe accused a colleague of being as blind as a goat, which, honestly, might be the world's earliest recorded peer review. Historians still argue whether the presence of so many errors reflects poor training or simply the immense difficulty of tracking celestial objects with naked eye observations. Most lean toward the latter. Even the best astronomers had no telescopes, no clocks, and only rudimentary instruments. Misinterpreting the heavens. Even when their math was right, their interpretations weren't always. The Babylonians, like most ancient peoples, believed the heavens communicated messages, signs from the gods woven into the movements of planets and stars. And while that worldview produced some brilliant predictive models, it also led to some truly wild conclusions. Take eclipses. The Babylonians eventually learned to predict lunar eclipses with remarkable accuracy, but their explanations for why eclipses happened were less scientific. One theory held that a demon dragon swallowed the moon as punishment for the king's sins. Another claimed the moon itself was hiding in shame from the wrath of the gods. A mainstream fact: eclipses were considered the most ominous of celestial events and were often linked to royal death or disaster. In one case, after predicting a total lunar eclipse, Babylonian priests appointed a substitute king, a random peasant who briefly took the throne to absorb the cosmic punishment. Once the danger passed, the substitute was dismissed and, unfortunately, often executed. Historians still argue whether the Babylonians genuinely believed in these mythic explanations or whether they used them symbolically to justify political actions. Perhaps both were true. They understood the pattern but still clothed it in religious meaning. When omens got weird. Then there's the world of celestial omens, a vast and complicated system that occasionally crossed the line from insightful to absurd. For instance, the appearance of Venus was usually tied to matters of fertility, love, or prosperity. But one omen text confidently declared that if Venus appears bright in the west, the price of fish will rise. One has to wonder if the local fishmongers were behind that one. Another tablet suggested that if Jupiter shone red during the spring equinox, sheep will give birth to monsters. This wasn't poetic metaphor. They meant actual physical mutations, which they believed the cosmos could foretell. The Enuma Anu Enlil, the Babylonian omen compendium, contained thousands of such predictions, some plausible, many baffling. A quirky tidbit: one tablet predicted that a solar eclipse on the 5th day of the month would cause the king's ears to fall off. No record suggests this ever happened, but imagine being the king reading that memo. Historians still argue whether these omens were meant literally or served as allegories for broader social or political events. The line between metaphor and prediction is blurry in Babylonian texts, sometimes intentionally so. We often imagine ancient scholars working in quiet harmony, but the truth is far messier. Babylonian astronomy was rife with rivalries, disagreements, and competing schools of thought. Some astronomers favored purely empirical methods, sticking to observation and calculation. Others leaned heavily into omen-based interpretation, seeing celestial events as messages rather than mechanical phenomena. And then there were hybrid thinkers who tried to bridge the two, using math to predict events and myth to explain their meaning. By the late Neo-Babylonian period, 6th to 5th centuries BCE, there were at least two distinct schools of astronomy, the so-called System A and System B. These differed in how they modeled planetary motion, one using step functions, the other employing more sophisticated zigzag calculations. A quirky example: scholars from rival schools sometimes mocked each other in the margins of tablets. One dismissed a competing prediction as nonsense fit for donkeys, which, in ancient scholarly circles, was the equivalent of a scathing academic review. Historians still argue whether these divisions represented genuine intellectual diversity or simply different temple traditions. Either way, the existence of debate shows that Babylonian science was not static. It evolved through disagreement. Translation troubles and modern misreads. Of course, the Babylonians weren't the only ones who made mistakes. Modern scholars, too, have occasionally fumbled in trying to interpret their work. Cuneiform is notoriously tricky, and subtle differences in symbols can radically change the meaning of a tablet. Early translators in the 19th century, for example, often confused astronomical terms with mythological ones, leading to bizarre claims, like the idea that Babylonians thought Mars was literally a sheep. They didn't. Sheep was a poetic nickname for the planet's reddish hue. A mainstream fact: Even today, new discoveries routinely overturn old assumptions about Babylonian astronomy, as fresh translations of neglected tablets reveal more nuanced models and unexpected methods. In the 1950s, one scholar mistranslated a reference to Venus as the bright cow of the night, prompting decades of jokes about celestial livestock. Later studies clarified that the word meant radiant one, not bovine. Historians still argue over many aspects of Babylonian science, including how much they understood about planetary retrograde motion, whether they recognized the heliocentric concept, even vaguely, and how far they went in predicting planetary conjunctions. Mistakes as building blocks. But here's the thing. Every misstep, every botched calculation, every overzealous omen, and every scholarly spat brought Babylonian astronomy a little closer to the truth. Each mistake was a stepping stone, each correction a refinement. And over centuries, those refinements built a knowledge base so robust that Greek astronomers, and later Islamic and European scholars, could use it as the foundation for their own breakthroughs. It's worth remembering that science itself is not a straight path from ignorance to knowledge. It's a meandering journey, filled with dead ends and false starts. And the Babylonians, without telescopes or precision instruments, without Newton's laws or Einstein's equations, were navigating that path in the dark, guided only by the faint light of the stars themselves. A mainstream fact. Many of their predictive methods, once dismissed as primitive, are now recognized as ingenious arithmetical algorithms, a precursor to the algebraic and trigonometric techniques of later civilizations. One could argue that their biggest mistake was believing the cosmos cared about human affairs. And yet, that very belief is what kept them watching night after night, and in the end, their persistence outshone their errors. Historians still argue whether the Babylonians should be considered scientists in the modern sense or priestly record keepers driven by ritual. But perhaps that's a false distinction. They were both, and their legacy exists precisely because they were never afraid to blend the two. The stars above Babylon didn't change because of their mistakes. They didn't care about wrong calculations, flawed predictions, or bizarre omens. But humanity did. And each error, scratched into clay, argued over in temple halls, or dismissed as donkey nonsense, carried knowledge forward, inch by inch, tablet by tablet. Because in the end, astronomy isn't about being right all the time. It's about looking up again and again, even after you've been wrong. And the Babylonians were very, very good at that. You wake before dawn, maybe to the sound of an alarm that's too loud or the soft vibration of a smartwatch against your wrist. You squint at the glowing screen, 6 a.m. sharp. Maybe you grumble, maybe you snooze it once or 3 times, but before you even get out of bed, you're already living inside an idea that's almost 4,000 years old. The concept of dividing a day into measurable slices, of organizing life by repeating celestial rhythms, and even the base 60 system that gives you 60 seconds in a minute, all of that traces its lineage back to the banks of the Euphrates. The Babylonians may have vanished as a civilization. Their ziggurats crumbled and their clay tablets scattered, but their fingerprints are all over our modern sense of time. It's a quiet inheritance, often invisible, yet profoundly present, ticking away in every clock, humming inside every calendar app, and shining above us in the constellations we still name and follow. As you move through this final stretch of our journey, you might find it comforting, and maybe a little humbling, to realize how deeply you're still connected to a world that existed thousands of years before your morning alarm ever rang. The Babylonian blueprint beneath the modern world. Start with something as basic as the clock. 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 24 hours, all of it is a Babylonian legacy. They were the ones who decided base 60 math was the best way to measure the heavens, likely because 60 divides evenly into so many numbers: 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And while they used it for star charts and lunar cycles, the Greeks later adapted it into a formal time system, which the Romans then spread across their empire. Fast forward 2 millennia, and you still check your phone at 5:47 p.m. using a system first scribbled into clay by someone in a linen kilt under a Mesopotamian sunset. The sexagesimal, base 60, system wasn't just used for time. Babylonians used it for angles too. That's why we divide a circle into 360 degrees, another echo of their cosmological thinking. A quirky tidbit: one cuneiform tablet found in Sippar shows a Babylonian scribe trying to explain fractions in base 60 using what looks suspiciously like a proto-word problem about beer rations, proof that even 3,500 years ago, math homework was already a thing. Historians still argue whether the base 60 system was originally a mathematical innovation or a religious choice, tied to their reverence for the 12 celestial constellations and the 5 visible planets. Either way, it stuck and became one of their most enduring gifts to human civilization. Then there's the calendar on your wall, or let's be honest, the one buried in your phone notifications. 12 months, roughly 30 days each, that's no accident. The Babylonian lunar calendar, structured around the cycles of the moon, set the template for nearly every calendar that followed. True, our modern Gregorian calendar is solar, not lunar, but its structure, months, weeks, leap adjustments, is built atop millennia of experimentation that began with those first Mesopotamian skywatchers. Even the concept of a week has roots in Babylonian practice. They recognized a 7-day period based on the phases of the moon. That little detail shaped the Judeo-Christian week and, by extension, the work and rest rhythm of the modern world. A mainstream fact: the Hebrew calendar, still in use for religious purposes, is a direct descendant of the Babylonian model, complete with similar month names and intercalation methods. A quirky tidbit: Babylonian farmers often named months after seasonal chores. One month's name translates roughly to the month of canal cleaning, which, honestly, is the kind of hyper-specific vibe modern calendar apps could use more of. Historians still argue whether the 7-day cycle was purely astronomical or also tied to their belief in 7 major celestial deities. But regardless of its origin, the rhythm stuck, and it now governs the tempo of nearly every society on Earth. The stars still speak their language. If you've ever read a horoscope, even just for fun, you're brushing against another Babylonian invention. The zodiac, that 12-part celestial belt we still divide the sky into, was formalized by Babylonian astronomers around the 5th century BCE. It was their way of organizing the chaos of the heavens, turning the swirling night into a structured cosmic calendar. Sure, modern astrology has evolved far beyond what they practiced, but the underlying framework is still theirs. Aries, Taurus, Gemini, those constellations follow Babylonian logic, not Greek or Roman. Even astronomers, who've long since shed the mythic storytelling of astrology, still use the zodiac as a coordinate system to map the sky. A mainstream fact: the earliest known list of zodiac constellations, from about 419 BCE, is Babylonian, and it matches almost perfectly with the 12 signs we still use today. One Babylonian text describes a constellation that no longer exists in modern astronomy, the field rat. Sadly, it didn't make the zodiac cut. Tough break for rat enthusiasts. Historians still argue whether the Babylonians chose 12 constellations purely because of lunar cycles or because they wanted each month to have a guardian star pattern. The truth is probably a bit of both. The spiritual weight of cosmic order. It's easy to think of time as mechanical, something measured by quartz vibrations and atomic oscillations. But for the Babylonians, it was profoundly spiritual. Time was the rhythm of the gods, the heartbeat of the universe. By syncing earthly life to celestial motion, they believed they were aligning humanity with the divine order. That idea hasn't vanished. When you count down to New Year's Eve, when you celebrate a birthday, when you mark the solstice or daylight saving time, you're participating, however unknowingly, in an ancient belief that celestial cycles shape human destiny. Many Babylonian festivals were tied directly to lunar phases, solstices, and planetary events, with priests timing rituals to coincide with celestial alignments. A quirky tidbit, one festival, Akitu, involved a ritual humiliation of the king, who was slapped by a priest to ensure cosmic balance. Imagine your boss doing that at the office New Year party. Historians still argue whether the Babylonians genuinely believed time itself was divine, or whether they used that idea to reinforce social and political hierarchies. Either way, the sacredness they attached to celestial rhythm still echoes in how we mark the passage of our own lives. A cosmic legacy that refuses to fade. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Babylon's legacy is how seamlessly it has become invisible. Nobody thanks a Babylonian when they check the time or schedule a Zoom meeting or scroll through a horoscope. But that's the nature of foundational ideas. They disappear into the fabric of daily life, so deeply woven that we forget there was ever a time without them. And yet, the clay tablets endure. The algorithms they carved in stylus scratches are still recognizable. The systems they built still hum beneath the digital scaffolding of our hyper-modern world. Every clock is a ziggurat in miniature. Every calendar a clay tablet reborn in pixels and glass. Every night sky a story they started writing and were still reading. And now, as our journey through Babylonian timekeeping and star watching draws to a close, it's time to slow down, really slow down. The pace of the narrative softens, like footsteps easing on a long walk home. The night sky above that ancient city, once blazing with omens and calculations, now becomes a vast silent canvas. The stars no longer speak of kings and empires. They simply shine, steady, patient, eternal. You feel the weight of their continuity. The same constellations that guided scribes with reed styluses now blink gently over the glow of your phone screen. The same lunar rhythm that dictated temple rituals now sets the date for your next meeting. The same celestial cycles that once crowned kings now measure coffee breaks, lunch hours, and late-night conversations. Time has always been there, flowing, circling, spiraling. We name it, slice it, and measure it, but it moves on regardless, a quiet river carrying us all. And maybe there's comfort in that. Maybe as you settle into the softness of your pillow and listen to the steady tick of a clock, or the silence between the seconds, you can feel a small connection to those ancient watchers on the ziggurat, eyes lifted to the heavens, hearts full of wonder. The stars are still there. The rhythm is still there. And tomorrow, when you wake, time will still be waiting, steady as ever. Sleep well. End of script. Sweet dreams.